Hello, everybody online. And Exodus chapter 1. Um, so when we come to Exodus, and I know it's been a few months now because we did Revelation, but we went through Genesis together, and Genesis and Exodus together. Of course, those are the two first books of the Pentateuch, meaning they're the first two books of Moses. It's believed and tradition holds that Moses wrote these books, these accounts himself. And so in Genesis and Exodus is kind of like, I don't know if books of the Bible have sequels, but if there are sequels, Exodus is definitely a sequel to Genesis. It's kind of a continuation of it's not kind of, it's a direct continuation of the events in Genesis. And in those two books, and we'll see this as we read along Exodus, but also as you read all throughout the scripture, those two books kind of form two major biblical themes that kind of reoccur. And so Genesis focuses on God's creative power, his sovereignty as a creative force, that God created the universe, that God created man, that God created everything. He didn't have any help. God did that in his own strength. But as we go on through Genesis and into Exodus, we see not only is God creative, but God is active. In other words, he didn't just create creation. He didn't create humanity and just step back and he's not an absent God. He's intricately involved in the history of humanity. He's intricately involved in the destiny and the plans of his people. He's made us in his likeness. He didn't just do that. Adam messed up and then he just left the scene. But as we get into Exodus, we see this relationship with God develop in his people, that God is a moral being, right? I hope we know that God is a moral being. I don't even know if that's a good term for, he's more than that. He defines that. But he expects us to live into that identity as his people, that we hold the same values and morals that he has. And so we really see that fleshed out, obviously, when we get into it. Probably not this week. I don't think we're going to get that far in. but when we get to the Ten Commandments and God's expectations of his people and of his creation, he's involved and he leads his people. Amen. Amen. Pretty cool. And then you kind of see those themes kind of repeat throughout the scriptures. But it's interesting that these first two books really kind of point that out. So let's jump into Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Told you, this is kind of the continuation of Genesis. We're picking up right where Genesis ends off with Joseph in Egypt. Verse 6, it says, "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died." And so that's significant because Joseph had great favor with Pharaoh, right? Joseph was considered one of their, he was so high up that he was considered one of their own. And so obviously as we get into this, we know after Joseph, they fall out of favor with, they lose their standing, obviously. And so much of that standing and that favor was centered around Joseph himself. And so as Joseph dies, now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. Verse 7, "But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them." So as we read in a minute, we're going to see that's important because they're growing. In other words, God's promise and God's word to Abraham is being fulfilled right there in Egypt. They haven't even made it to the promised land yet, but God is blessing them, and they're fruitful, and they're multiplying. But if you're an Egyptian, as we're going to read, that may make you nervous. Verse 8, then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So this new Pharaoh that has no care for Joseph, no care for his family, he recognizes the threat militarily that this growing nation within their own nation could pose to them. They had enemies at that time. The Hittites were a threat to them, and man, if they teamed up with any of them, they could overthrow us. Strategically, makes sense. It's problematic. And so, what's the solution? Verse 11: They put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. And so here's this picture, and verse 12 is so important. And again, this is a reoccurring motif or theme or whatever as you go through the scriptures all the way into the Gospels and into Acts. It says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites more. It's interesting how God's people over and over again tend to grow and multiply under oppression, under difficult times, under persecution. And so here's another example of even though they were enslaved and they were worked harshly, in other words, this was hard labor. This was not, all slavery is bad, but this is hard labor slavery. Even within that, God kept his word, and they thrived and they multiplied. And it's kind of interesting when you think about that, because and this might be a difficult kind of thing to grapple with, but God almost used Egypt, if you will, if you think of Egypt as a womb for the people of Israel. Because more than likely, if they had all just gone on into the promised land at that time, they would have, in their own history tells us, they would have just intermarried, and they would have started worshiping pagan God. It would have been, so in a weird way, and this is not a pro-slavery thing. This is God will use anything to accomplish his will. In a weird way, their time in Egypt protected them and grew them into this nation. Not weird? You know what I'm saying? They didn't disperse. They didn't go and absorb into other cultures. It kind of pushed them together and isolated them. And they multiplied, and they multiplied, and they multiplied, and they multiplied. And even in slavery, God was growing them into this people, this nation. That's interesting. It's very interesting to me. I'm sure that's not how they would have wanted to fulfill God's purposes in their life. But God used that to fulfill his purposes in their life. And I think it's important for us sometimes, because we don't always understand, God, why? Why this or why that? But no matter what we're experiencing, no matter what we're going through, if we are in Jesus Christ, I guarantee you, God's word promises he's doing something in us. He's growing, if we allow him to. He's growing us into who he's called us to be. And that doesn't mean God makes every terrible thing happen to us, but he allows us to go through it, and he goes with us. And maybe he does will us to go through it, because something has to happen in us. And so it's important that right at the outset we see that, yeah, they were enslaved. Yes, slavery is a bad thing, but that God also used that to protect them in that time as a people, as a bloodline. Any other thoughts on that first section there? Interesting stuff.
I kind of have one.
Sure.
this with the Jewish people, I think probably was a God thing, but
Yeah.
I see it's going on in the world right now. I'm not sure it's a God thing. A few people, Kay, David, and I went to Serbia, and it was overrun with Muslims coming in from all parts of the world. And the reason was because the rest of Europe closed their borders. And so Serbia had open borders, and it just piled up into there. And we went there, and they were all in these huge camps.
Yeah.
And they just didn't know what to do with them all. And they were being fed and everything else, but they were just basically in prison. And I don't know. It just seems like it's such a bad thing. And Europe is really struggling with that right now.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
And that I don't know. I don't see it as a God thing.
See what is a God thing?
Well, like with the Jewish people, you said it was a God's plan, and how certain groups can grow among them. And Europe right now struggling with all that.
Yeah, I think there's a different situation that's going on in the world today than what's happening. And again, I don't think that God was happy that they were enslaved, or that God's not pro-slavery. No. In the way that we're talking about, or in any way. But God will use that. There's a difference. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I see the difference.
Yeah.
But the Jews, almost through the history of the world, have had this problem going to other countries.
Of course.
And then tossing them out or imprisoning them or whatever. And I just don't know why.
I know why. Not to be overly arrogant, but as a Christian, I can tell you why. Okay. It's because it's the devil, and I don't say that as easy it's the devil did it. It's demonic, and I've said that before. The attacks on the Jewish, it's demonically motivated, because what would Satan love to destroy more than anything? So in the Old Testament, Satan was coming against the Jewish people, whether it's through Egypt or Samaria or Babylon, whoever, he's coming against them because he knows that God made a promise that salvation would come through the Jews, that Jesus was going to come through the Jews. And so enemy number one for the devil was them. If we can destroy them, or if we could lead them so far astray that they don't even exist anymore because they intermarry out of even being a discernible race. In the devil's mind, he's destroyed now God's covenant with Abraham, God's covenant of salvation. And so that still carries through. I think the devil would love nothing more than to attack and to destroy God's covenant with Abraham. Because God's covenant with Abraham is not just about the Jews, it's about all of humanity. So you destroy God's covenant with the Jews, you destroy his relationship with humanity. Because the Jews, the Israelites, when God made that covenant, it was to be a means of salvation, not just to Abraham, but to his family. And not just to his family, but to their grandkids. And not just to their grandkids, but the generations that would come, and the nation. And not just to that nation, but to every nation on earth. See, it was to be this thing. And so the devil knows that. And if the devil can attack that, and if the devil can destroy that, he would see that as a victory. And so that's why I say, I think the anti-Semitism that we're seeing today, John, and this rise even in our own country, that's just a bunch of woke college kids. No, I think it's demonic. I think it's demonic, and I think the devil preys on people that are vulnerable. And I almost feel bad for all of those kids that are brainwashed into this, because I think it's demonic influence. And so because of that, and you're right, the world's always come against them as a people. But I believe that's why. I guess I could be wrong. But from what I read in the scriptures, I think that's why you see that with them over and over and over. Man, if the devil can get them, if the devil can destroy them, what a blow to God's overall plan.
A lot of it was their own fault too, though, because they strayed from God.
Well, and the devil will get them, not just militarily, but, well, if I can get them to give up on their own identity and who they are, and if I can get them to reject God, great, that's a win too. You know, if God's people don't believe in God, wonderful. So yes, I think it's not just militarily. It is, but it's also spiritual.
Spiritual, because they quit
Sure.
believing in God himself, and so in a sense they were punished,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why they were spread out all over the world.
Yeah.
In a sense, and
Sure.
and then they came back in 48 was the big move back to Israel.
Sure.
But
Sure.
it's partly their own fault, but a lot of what's going on today is not their fault. That's like I think John's trying to say, but God still uses that because he can use anything for his glory or for his purposes, regardless of what it is.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's throughout the whole Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Jack.
I like the indication here that God's word to Abraham was that his seed would multiply.
Yep.
And in verse 12 it says that they multiplied and grew.
Mm-hmm.
So
Been driving the Egyptians nuts.
right, but
Like, whoa.
But God promised Abraham that he, that his seed, would grow, and this is evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Should we go a little further?
Yeah, sure.
Let's see. Where did we stop? 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Sifra and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women enduring childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. Tell me that's not demonic. That's demonic. Let her live. Verse 17, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. And I love that because Pharaoh, you have to understand, was one of the most powerful people, if not the most powerful person in the world at that point. And he said, hey, you better do this. And I love that comment that the midwives, they didn't fear Pharaoh, they feared God. And so they're like, well, we ain't doing that. There's nothing that Pharaoh could do to us that's mightier than what God could do to us. I love that healthy sense of fear of the Lord. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered, Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Isn't that great? I had somebody say, like, well, Pastor, that's not that great, because didn't they lie right there? And I said, not necessarily, and I don't think they did because of what Jack brought up. I think that's probably true. I think they were probably cranking out babies because God had already blessed them that way. And so there's probably truth to that. Like, what do you want us to do? We can't even get there. These babies are coming out, Pretty funny. I don't know if it's funny, but these midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Not those spoiled Egyptian women, right? Verse 20. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. That's pretty harsh. And so you want to talk about oppression. I don't even think oppression is a word. Persecution. He makes a decree to all the people. Hey, if there's a baby boy, you need to report it because we got to kill that baby boy. If he's Jewish, we got to stop this growing strength of this people. We got to stop the fruitfulness of this people, which we know it's not going to happen because God had already ordained it. God had already said that this was going to happen. But Yeah, I think, John, that's just another picture of what you're saying. Like, you're like, oh my goodness, you know. But I really do think there's a spiritual element to that. It's not, we can look at it historically and say, well, he was worried about a military coup. And I understand that, and I'm sure that was motivation. I'm sure that was part of it. But I'll tell you what, the devil would love nothing more than for God's plans to have been squashed right there.
And I'm feeling that is dynamic.
Yeah, it is.
What we're doing today is the same, I feel.
I do too.
We're wiping out kids, like, now you can be a boy and a girl.
Right.
Or we're just destroying.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, like it's.
Yeah. And not only do we have a nation and a culture, really, that's a growing sentiment. It used to be very Western, but
Yeah,
it's spreading. That's demonic. It's no value of life. It's I think I read a report that they're giving out free abortions at the DNC. You know, they're not giving out free T-shirts or bracelets. They're giving out free abortion.
They're giving out hot dogs with it.
They show
Yeah.
the wagon there where people can go.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's demonically influenced. Yes, absolutely. It's evil. It's a destruction of God's creation. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, she's preaching.
So were the Hebrew women different than the Jewish women?
The Hebrew women different. They're the same thing.
The midwives?
Yeah.
So he was just calling the midwives?
They're working. Yeah, you had people that worked as between the two. Yeah. Yep.
Surprising there was only two of them.
There's not. So in this account, they're listed, but there would have been many, many midwives. In this account, this is we have their names. We know they were two involved,
Two that stood out.
but there were not two midwives for all of the slaves. Yeah, there were a lot
Yeah,
more.
they couldn't get it.
Yeah. I would guess the idea is that they're representing the larger group, and I'm sure they communicate and say, hey, listen, let's take our time getting to those births. And we'll just tell them, like, sorry, we weren't there.
They had a hard time getting out, huh?
Yeah.
Aren't they also doing vasectomies too?
Yeah, the DNC.
Probably, yeah.
So,
Free.
you know, they're not very different Democrats.
Another way to bring up.
I gotta pause the recording for a minute. I hope you didn't hear that, but it was funny. We can repeat later. And here's these are terrible things. These are awful things. And kind of to come back to John's original point, it's not to make light of these awful, terrible, demonic, evil things, but it is to elevate God's working in the midst of those things. And things that, as we're going to see, as we'll jump into, I think we can get through probably 2 chapters tonight. God put everything into place, and the enemies of God think that they're doing all these things, but they're really setting up God's master plan. It doesn't make them less evil. It doesn't make the things they do less gross and wicked, but you can't outsmart God. There's no, and it was true then, John, and the world's such a mess today, but it's true today too. Hamas can't outsmart God. Iran, I don't know, whoever, Putin, whoever you want to throw in, the DNC, the RNC, we're going to be fair. They can't outsmart God. You know what I mean? His will be done. And Exodus is proof of that. And as we get deeper into it, you're like, oh my goodness, like he had everything planned, everything set up. And for the people in the midst of this stuff, think about being enslaved for hundreds of years. This was not like, that was a rough decade. This is generations. They could never see that. Wow, isn't God doing amazing things right now? They had to be like, God, why would you allow all of this? What are you doing? And sometimes I think we can feel like that. Like, really? Is God in the midst of all this? Is it? And the answer is yes. And we look at Exodus and we say, he always has been. But for the people in it, it takes faith.
I find it in that regard, what you're just talking about, is he allowed Moses to see him across the Jordan, his people. But he wouldn't allow Moses or that generation before to go.
Oh, later. Yeah.
Later,
Yeah. Well, and even Moses got in a little bit of trouble there and never got to put his feet over there. Yeah. Let's go a little further. Let's see if we can get through two chapters tonight. Oh, could you imagine? Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. It says, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. And so this is an important tribe amongst the not that they aren't all important, but this is an important tribe amongst the Israelites. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But verse 1, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. So if you go into Hebrews, the chapter of faith, Moses' parents are actually mentioned in there. And so this act of hiding him for 3 months, yes, it's obviously an act of love, but it's also a great act of faith, because they were openly going against the order of Pharaoh. And so they hid Moses for 3 months. Let's go a little further in verse 3. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Well, let's read a little further before we pick this apart. But verse 7. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? I mean, look at these details. Verse 8, yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. See, Moses' mom, he was going to learn in the palace, but he was also going to learn about his people. Do you see how God orchestrated that?
Yeah.
That's amazing. She went and got the baby's mother. Verse 9, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. See, not only does she have influence now in her baby and a hand in raising Moses. Do you want to know how Moses knew who he was? This is how Moses knew who he ultimately was. I believe we don't have a lot of details of how this played out, but we know that God used this woman. And she got paid for it. Hey, who got paid for raising their children? She got paid. She didn't really raise them, but she had a hand in it. She was part of it. Take this baby, nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. Verse 10. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Not only faith, but sacrifice. It's just amazing. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Isn't that amazing? Like this horrible situation where they're killing babies. Like we just talked, it's evil, it's wicked. They're killing babies. And you have this beautiful, intimate, intricate plan of God that's playing out right in the middle of all this wickedness. Right in the middle of all this hopelessness, there's this path of God that's being carved right in the middle of it, that God set up. That it wasn't just random that they tried to keep their baby for 3 months. It wasn't just random that they're like, we can't hide him anymore. That in faith they had to come to a point where they said, we got to let him go and trust the Lord with him. That it wasn't just a random set of circumstances that Pharaoh's daughter was like, I'm going to go down to the river for a while. It wasn't just random that she said, well, yeah, I'd like to take care of this baby, but, let's use one of his own. That they went and got the mother, Moses' mom. This is God carving a path through the darkness, carving a path through the chaos and the evil of the day. And friends, I want to tell you, I don't always know. It's easy to look back on this thousands of years ago and see God's path cutting right through it. And you're like, oh, of course that's what's happening. Couldn't have been that way for Moses' mom. Couldn't have been that way for the enslaved people. We'll read on. It wasn't that way for Moses. But they were faithful and they trusted God. And now, generations later, we look back and we're like, man, God is awesome. Look what he did. And so when it feels like we're in the dark, and John, like you said, there's just evil and demonic influence, and it's like, where is God in all this? He's cutting a path through the darkness, my friend. He's made a promise that he won't leave us, that he won't forsake us. When it comes to the Israelites, he's made a promise that there would always be a remnant. They would never be eliminated. He's going to see that through. And sometimes, it seems like dark days, and you're like, oh, and they are. And they're evil. I don't want to make light of the wickedness, the evil around us. But God is making his way through it. And he's using his people, and he's using normal people. That's one of the interesting things about when we get into this study, is Moses starts as a lowly person, and I don't think I'm spoiling this for anybody, but he becomes a very elevated, powerful person within Egypt. In fact, if you read, the Bible doesn't necessarily tell us this, but if you read Josephus is a Jewish historian, lived a long time ago. But according to Josephus, he was in line to possibly be Pharaoh himself one day. And so you would think like, wow, what a perfect position. He could just be Pharaoh and then say, you know what? No slaves, you're all free. He could have done it that way. But God, and so as you go through the scriptures, you run into different characters that are seen as, they're not like Jesus in perfection. They're not like Jesus literally, but they're precursors to, they're a picture of what Jesus is going to do perfectly. They're an image. They do in part what Jesus is going to do. In Genesis, Joseph would have been one of those. Joseph is seen as a precursor to Jesus. We can see images of Jesus through his life and what God did through him. After this, Joshua is seen as a, I don't know if precursor is the right word, but you know what I'm saying? There's people that are like, oh, God did a work like he's going to do through Jesus perfectly through this flawed human being. Moses is one of those people. And one of the common things that we see, one of the most evident things we see in Moses' life and in Jesus' life, that they set the captives free, right? They both set that was their mission. They set the captives free. But they could not do it from a status of earthly royalty. They had to do it from a place of servitude and lowliness. And so it's interesting as we get into this and we see Moses in his own mind and in our understanding, it's like, well, that'd be perfect if he was just Pharaoh. Because then he could just change the laws and say, I'm going to set all these guys free. But that's not how God works. God works through the humble and he works through the lowly. And so it's interesting because Moses is being set up as this perfect conduit for God to move and for God to do something amazing. But that's not always easy. And there's such a lesson for that I feel like I'm jumping ahead of us, but as we read that, there's such a lesson for that. Sometimes I don't think any of us expect to be kings on earth or queens on earth or the president of the United States or live and, be tech billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. But sometimes we do get this idea that, yeah, I want to serve God from a place of comfort, and I want to serve God my way, and I want it to be easy, and I want it to always be good. Like it's always good, but good and like, oh, this is nice. But we see in Moses, we've seen in servants before Moses, we see in Jesus himself, God works when we lower ourselves, and God works through the humble. And Moses is an example of that, which we'll read as we go on. Yes, Rick.
I think of the Ten Commandments story.
Yep.
Where does, in this, Pharaoh would have been considered Moses' brother, right? Because
Yeah.
Ramses was the main man,
Yeah.
and then there was Pharaoh.
Well, Ramesses would have also been in line to be. He eventually he was Pharaoh. The nature of their relationship, from strictly biblical accounts, is a little bit more vague, and that's why I said when you go outside into Josephus, that's where you'll read stuff that Moses was so favored that it's possible that he was in line to. And I didn't say that as a. We know that for sure. I said that just as a. Moses wasn't like a redheaded stepchild.
Yeah.
Moses, they saw him as one of their own. They, you know, I shouldn't have said redheaded stepchild. I apologize. I have a redheaded child. Yeah, she would not like that. You're not a stepchild, are you? You know what? It's fine if you are, actually.
God loves them all.
That's right. Stepchildren are great. It's so much worse that I know I'm recording this right now because I just came out. I'm sorry. He was not seen as, let me just say this definitively. Stepchildren are not lesser people than anybody else. In fact, a lot of them are probably better than others. But Moses was not seen as a secondary citizen to them. He was seen as a citizen of Egypt. He was seen as royalty in Egypt. And so that's kind of my point there is that, it's not like they were like, well, yeah, we picked this kid out of the river and he's kind of, no, he was the man.
They killed that guy.
Well, obviously that's going to change, but man, we're jumping ahead. We got to start reading.
Your point about God moving through and getting things done on his program.
Yeah.
So we have a baby in a basket and the bulrushes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm sure that baby got attention or got noticed by his crying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But isn't this the same Moses that later went to God and said, I don't know what to say. I'm not eloquent in speech.
Yeah.
So God provided the baby with lungs to cry,
Mm-hmm.
to get attention
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
this plan. And then later to go back to speak to Pharaoh and didn't know what to say or what to do. But within the plan of God's plan, he provided.
Absolutely. And not only did he provide, but he made Moses almost a perfect candidate for this in that, we talked about, oh man, his mom was taking care of him and raising him. So he had that knowledge of his people, and I believe knowledge of God it's at some point implanted into him from her. But he also understood Egypt. He knew how it worked. He knew who Pharaoh was. He knew, and so without anybody predicting or being able to plan it out, he almost became the perfect candidate to go. Probably not in any way that he wanted to, but he had his feet in both worlds, which I'm sure was helpful. It gave him an audience. We'll get there. We're talking about future stuff right now. Let's read a little more. His sister stood at a distance, and Pharaoh's daughter went down. Where were we? Verse 11. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. That's important there. I've seen this sometimes displayed in Hollywood, and to kind of make Moses a more sympathetic, I think, at this point. When I see it displayed a lot of times in drama, it's almost an emotional reaction. He sees something happening and he intervenes, and then he kind of kills this guy in a kind of a fit of rage. Or there was a cartoon, the Prince of Egypt, and that one he kind of takes the whip from him and accidentally knocks him over. You know, and this is important to understanding him and especially the next phase of his life. Right here, look at what it says. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. No, he murdered this guy. He was like, are there any witnesses? He killed this guy. He murdered this guy. And I'm not like, hey, let's look at what a horrible thing Moses did. But I think that's important to really understanding him and some of his fear and some of his even shame. He murdered this guy, and then he hid the body. You know, so this was an intentional, thought out act that he did here. Verse 13. The next day he went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed that Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. Isn't that interesting that in his own strength, he thought like, you know what, I'm going to help my people. And I'm going to kill this guy. And then now I'm going to intervene in this problem. And I wonder if in his mind he thought like, oh, wow, he's getting involved with us and he's really helping us. And they reject him. They're like, dude, who are you? And they even tell him, we know what you did. Like, who are you to come and tell us who's wrong and who's right? Who are you to judge us? I would guess, I don't know for sure, I would guess not the response that he was expecting. Not this heroic, like, and it's interesting because God obviously gave him a heart for his people. He started to see this, which is a good thing. But at first here, he really tried to kind of operate in his own power and his own knowledge, and it just made a mess. It didn't help anything, and they didn't even receive him. They didn't even say, hey, good job killing that dirty Egyptian. They called him out, like, who are you to judge us? Frank.
The guy that was getting beat up by the Egyptian apparently hadn't disappeared. Because I can't imagine that he plotted and planned to kill the Egyptian when nobody was around, because if the guy is mistreating and beating on the guy, I'm sure he didn't just get up and walk away, you know what I mean?
The Egyptian,
I mean,
yeah.
We don't have any story behind it or more in depth.
Or he didn't look around good enough. He may have looked at it.
The guy was on the ground, didn't see him.
Things like that tend to get found out,
Yeah.
as does most sin. Eventually, you'll get found out.
All sins are eventually found.
Yeah. So there's a situation like that. Moses was afraid. He thought, what I've done must have become known. And so now he's afraid. And rightfully so. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. They went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flocks. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to rule their father, he asked them, why have you returned so early today? They answered, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. Where is he? Reuel asked his daughters. Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat. Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. Verse 24, powerful. God heard their groaning. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham. Excuse me. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. God heard their groaning. He heard their cries. He heard their prayer. And God remembered his covenant. And however many thousand years later, I want to tell you today that God remembers his covenant. Amen. And God does what God says he's going to do. Amen. Yeah. So Moses runs and he hides. And it's so interesting how even this is orchestrated by God. God's brought him to this place, and as we kind of move into chapter 3, we'll hold off on chapter 3 till next week. But it's interesting because I've always as I've studied Exodus and read this multiple times, I've always found it interesting that not just when we think of this, we tend to think of the plagues, and we tend to think of the parting of the Red Sea and Mount Sinai, as we should. Those are all very important. But I've become so fascinated with God's preparation, first of his people, that to bring us back to how we started this study, that as painful as it was, as difficult as it was, God was preparing his people for something, even while they were enslaved. He was preparing them and binding them together as a nation and as a people. He was making them strong and plentiful. But God was also preparing Moses. And I love that as you go through this story, you can see God preparing Moses for this thing. And it wasn't all the way from his birth, how God orchestrated his safe birth in a very hostile environment, in a place where he shouldn't have even survived. God made a way. And then, like we already talked about, he had his own Jewish mother as a midwife to talk to him, to share with him about God, to share with him about their people and who they were, and to instill in him some sense of who he really was. But also to be raised in the palace and to understand the workings of Egypt and to have some level of authority and power within that. And then Moses messes up. How many of you have messed up? And in his mind, I would guess when he went to Midian, the reason he went to Midian was Egypt didn't have anything to do with Midian. There were no treaties. There were no alliances. He was hiding. He was like, well, I got to go somewhere now. And I wonder if maybe Moses thought, like, man, I was in such a position to help my people. I was in such a position to make a difference for God or to do something powerful or important. And now I've squandered it because I got emotional and I did something out of emotion, in my own strength, in my own wisdom. And now I just got to go find somewhere to hide and live out the rest of my life. And, we're not told that intimately, but I wonder if that's what, I assume that's what brought Moses to Midian. Like, I'll go be a farmer. What can I do now? But even in Moses retreating and Moses going there, God brought him there. And God prepared Moses. And I believe, we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. I don't spoil too much. But Moses isn't just there for a few months. Moses is there for a long time, a big chunk of his life. And he learned what it was to work hard. He learned what it was to labor. And I think that's important. I don't know as the Pharaoh that he probably was real accustomed to hard labor on any level. But he went and he learned that. And I think that even had to deepen his appreciation for his people and his sorrow for his people.
Humbled him also.
It humbled him. It changed who he was again. It was part of his process. Yeah, John.
I think there's such a similarity here when the two Jewish people or two Jewish men are fighting. He says, "Who are you to lord over us?"
Yeah.
I mean, and then they go tell the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
I mean, what is that? I mean, it's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
1,000 years later.
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities like that parallels. Yeah. The only difference is I have a feeling that response had to shock Moses.
Yeah.
You're going to go narc me out, man? I was trying to help you guys.
He wasn't prepared for that.
No. But like Crystal said, he needed to be humbled. Because to serve God and to really accomplish what God wants any of us to accomplish, it's done in humility, friends. It's not done through the power of men. It's not done through the status of men. It's not even done through the talents of men, unless God ordains that. It's done through the power of God, and as we serve Him. And so, was Moses an unlikely candidate? In a lot of ways, yeah. Especially now. Now he's hiding out. They want to kill him. It's like, well, yeah. I see what he was thinking about. Like, well, I blew it now. What am I going to do? But you look at Paul. God had this guy that was the perfect guy to go and reach the religious folks, the Jews. But he's like, nah, I'm going to send you to go get the Gentiles. And then he had Peter, the common man, that was really equipped to go get the Gentiles. He says, no, you're going to go talk to all the Pharisees and the religious folks. And that's just how God works. Because when we're operating in humility, we're not depending on our own skills, on our own wisdom. We're depending on God and His wisdom and where He leads us. Moses' wisdom had created a mess. There's a guy buried in the sand, and his own people really aren't very fond of him. And so, yeah, I think this time in Midian, I think it was a humbling experience. I think it was a maturing experience for him. And it wasn't just him hiding out. Maybe in his mind it was. But I really believe it was God preparing him for what God wanted him to do. And I think a lot of times we get into that. I feel like we in life, we just feel stalled out, or we feel like, God, what are you doing? But if we would just remain faithful, if we would just remain open to what God is calling us to do, I believe that God is constantly preparing each and every one of us for His next work. I believe that. I don't think He's done or said, well, Josh, you take a breather for a while, and just we'll take a few years and just let you sit. It may feel like that sometimes, but God's doing something. But we have to remain faithful, and we have to remain open to what He wants to do in us. And so I think that's a good place for us to land with our opening study on Moses or Exodus. Any thoughts? Any closing remarks?
But when you look back in the Bible from the beginning to the end, nothing changed. People are still bad and evil.
It's pretty cyclical. Yeah, it kind of.
So it just goes like a cycle, from the beginning to the end.
Yeah. Yeah, and this wouldn't be the last time that God's people were enslaved or oppressed or. And again, I think Frank mentioned it earlier. A lot of times it was because they had turned their own backs on God. They had rejected Him. Yeah. But God always, again, that theme, and we see it kind of start here. Really, it started in Genesis, but we have that creative, almighty, powerful theme, but also that intimate and involved God theme. That God doesn't just leave His people to their own destruction and devices, because that's how He is. Thank goodness. Amen. All right. Does somebody want to